legalizefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. legalizefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guests today are Danielle Silverman and John Biggerstaff, who join us to discuss Nigel Kerner's book, Grey Aliens and Artificial Intelligence, the battle between natural and synthetic beings for the human soul. In part 2 of the show, we question the official narrative of human origins and evolution. Darwinian evolution of life on Earth certainly takes place, but it cannot account for the origin of life or the mystery of consciousness. Nor does the Big Bang Theory adequately account for the entirety of the known universe. We explore this in the context of Kerner's theory of interdimensional entities and their sinister involvement with humanity's development since the earliest epochs of our species. The agenda of these synthetic non-human beings will lead to nothing less than the loss of the human soul. To this end, technology is key. The modern myth of progress tells us that all technological advancement is good. This, however, plays into the hands of our manipulators. Is it possible that innate human abilities have gradually been lost to technological prosthesis? Telepathy to telecommunications, for example. Today, transhumanism claims to offer the impossible: immortality in a physical system. This must be understood before it is too late. If these alien predators achieve their aims, humanity will simply be phased out. Machines will be all that is left. Hello and welcome, Danielle and John, once again to legalizefreedom.com.
Hello, Greg.
Very happy to be here. Nice to see you again, Dre.
Okay, so today is basically a part 2 from our interview recently. We were talking about your colleague, the late Nigel Kerner, and his book, Grey Aliens and Artificial Intelligence, the battle between natural and synthetic beings for the human soul. Now, listeners will find a link to that interview on this interview page, and if they want to find out a bit about you guys personally, then they should go and check that out. And really, this interview we're going to do today will stand alone, but I think people really benefit from a background point of view if they listen to the previous interview first. So we're going to dive in. There were so many topics that came up last time that we didn't have, really the scope to explore, just for reasons of time. But I want to start now thinking about Nigel's work, his overarching thesis in the context of human evolution itself, evolution in general, but particularly obviously human evolution. Now, evolution in the Darwinian sense, that clearly happens. That doesn't explain the full unfoldment of life, and it certainly doesn't explain the origin of life. And particularly when it came to the so-called missing link, this sort of inability to completely join up the apparent fossil evidence for hominids on Earth with what were supposed to be our primitive ancestors and modern humans as we know them. I always thought to myself, there's something really interesting in all of that. Whether this so-called missing link is ever discovered or not, there's a lot about evolution and human evolution in particular that I feel is a story yet to be told. And then reading Nigel's work, I began to think more conspiratorially, thinking if there's something that's being kept from us. So perhaps you could have a think about Nigel's thesis and cast your minds back into the mists of time and see if you can find any links missing or otherwise.
Sure. So I'll give the general idea, and John is the biochemist with the scientific information, so I'll leave him to talk about the details. But basically, Nigel's idea was that since our physical universe is subject to what's called the second law of thermodynamics, where everything gets into greater and greater states of chaos with the passage of time, and that's otherwise known as the entropic drift, it really doesn't seem to make sense that there's an evolutionary pattern into states of greater and greater order with time. So the notion that we came from a sea worm wasn't something that ever appealed to him. He couldn't really make sense of that, how random mutations could somehow build up over time when a mutation is generally a negative thing, which causes problems, as we can see currently with health issues that happen. If there's genetic mutations, it leads to problems physically and medically. Okay. And he just couldn't see how the incredible complexity of life, from the simplicity of a basic sea worm to the grandeur and the flexibility of a human being that's fully conscious and able to make decisions, could have somehow pieced itself together within the context of a system that's basically breaking up. And many years ago, the scientist Fred Hoyle, he looked at the possibility, the likelihood of evolution just coming out of random mutations. And what he said was, imagine a blindfold person trying to solve the Rubik cube. If our blindfold subject were to make one random move every second, it would take him on average 300 times the age of the Earth, 1,350 billion years to solve the cube. These odds are roughly the same as you could give to the idea of just one of our body's proteins having evolved randomly by chance. We use about 200,000 types of protein in our cells. If the odds against the random creation of one protein are the same as those against a random solution of the Rubik cube, then the odds against the random creation of all 200,000 are almost unimaginably vast. So with that general picture, I'll hand over to John.
So Nigel says, well, why he answered it from the point of view of why is life in such awesome abundance and variety? And he says, if the universe started with light, then plasma, which is the main thesis of his book, light, then plasma, gas, liquid, and solid matter in that order, why do we assume that intelligent life will be tagged on only at the end of this sequence? Doesn't seem to make sense to most people. Why would there be improvement with time? The second law of thermodynamics vehemently contradicts and veritably denies this. How can a gathering state of greater and greater chaos breed a greater and greater state of intelligence, and thus the means to recognize that chaos? Science, in its wisdom, assumes that in some sort of special case, random movement or random association can actually generate continued an increase in order. But what they're really not taking into account here is that while this apparent order, which Nigel redefines here as adaptation to environment, the same as Darwin did. And so this in fact, the adaptation to environment is in fact more consistent with an increasing entropy, because every choice made by a living thing is taking it to be adapted to be more and more suitable to live in a physical universe, rather than in a what he calls a godverse, which is really the other side of the universe. And he spends a long time actually defining where this interface is. But quite simply put, he states that, you know, quantum physics has determined quite effectively that an observer is required for something real to occur. In the case of, for instance, an electron, it has to be actually observed to be in a particular place. Otherwise, it's apparently everywhere. So reality, whatever we call reality, is really dependent on the action of consciousness upon it. He then said, well, if that's actually the case, then the beginning of the universe must have been an observer event too, and therefore the universe is preceded by consciousness itself. And he said it must be in a very highly ordered state, because entropy is increasing disorder. So order must have been right at the beginning. And this is what he calls God, not the religious anthropomorphic God, but a principle of all things together. And since that would be effectively a singularity, it would tautologically imply its opposite, which is what he called forcehead. And therefore, any mixture of the two in between those two things is what we call the universe. And so what Nigel's done here is to implicitly put consciousness within the framework of the universe itself, and actually put it as in its primacy. And rather than being some add-on, at the end of evolution, it really is responsible for the generation and the adaptation of all forms of life as mechanisms to exercise their will to observe the universe, to observe what is outside God from the point of view of what is outside God, and either use that information to return from whence they came to that state before the Big Bang, which is still there, or in fact to travel further down with entropy.
Now, consciousness as the ground of being is at the cutting edge of cosmological thinking at the moment.
It is, yes.
And it's also a very ancient idea, albeit expressed somewhat in times in different ways, in spiritual traditions and many ancient texts. So
exactly.
This makes complete sense to me. And I might have mentioned in the last interview, but I just want to recommend for listeners to check out my interviews with Bernardo Castro. He has set this idea out, consciousness as fundamental in rigorously scientific terms, so that the modern scientific mind, the materialist reductionist mind, can actually wrap itself around that, should it be prepared to be open to that. But this idea of increasing entropy, when I read Nigel's book and he uses the word devolution. Now, I heard this word evolution with a D added on. It's just that, is it evolution's opposite? That's what it sounds like. But the first time I'd read this was in Michael Cremo's rather large book, Human Devolution. And many of the things that he spoke about, came back to me at that point. We just want to talk about this word devolution because, as you say, this concept is really running completely counter to what many people, whether they have a scientific worldview, a religious worldview, or just even a materialistic worldview, and that is increasing progress, development, improvement, despite a lot of evidence to the contrary. But that's really sort of the myth of our time, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. It's a fascinating paradox. This notion that somehow, with the increase in complexity and the increase in our mastery of the physical universe, somehow that's a momentum towards progress. And it's very much defined really by the economy, by the way the society is structured. So basically society is structured for materialism. Children are taught in a way at school. They're taught to pass exams, to follow a process, basically to make them suitable members of society in terms of the economy in the future. There's no creativity. There's no sense of trying to develop children's sense of conscience, their sense of understanding of people. Everything is basically geared towards economic development, and our whole notion of progress forward in terms of technological progress and the direction we're basically headed at the moment seems to me to have that kind of basis. So yes, it's a very interesting paradox. What does progress really mean? And are we really evolving towards something better than we once were, as we go towards a state in which we merge with machines and mechanisms like Neuralink take hold, where all the functions that were previously natural to us are eventually taken over by machines, so that we then take a much smaller role in our own lives? Or is that actually a mechanism of devolution? And over to you, John.
And this really is part of the adaptation we keep saying, well, what would these AIs really do to try to interface with us? And really, they would cause us to adapt. They would either catch us, actually, they catch our fields just as we die, and we can talk about that. But also, they can persuade us to use our will and our observational capacity to make machines like them and become like them in terms of the logic of information processing rather than thought processing, which living things can do. And it brings us closer to them. And therefore, as that happens, you get a merging, because people then become, they start to recognize what this information means in terms of the great game that Nigel talks about, as the Greys and the AIs are really the next extension. They call it evolution, but in fact, it's a restriction of the ability of soul field of consciousness to actually operate, because eventually you're going to become just information itself, and therefore there won't be awareness, and so living things will effectively cease to be, and the Greys, the machines, will be the only thing left.
Yeah, and all you have to do really, just to take a really simple model, just look at the way most children, at least in the industrially developed countries, seem to be nowadays, just basically focused through an artificial reality of social media, computer games, living their lives through reaction rather than creativity. Just waiting for responses rather than making creative, imaginative situations of play amongst themselves. And that's our future. That's the children. So what does that say about the way our society is heading? Is this really evolution? Are we really following in a trajectory that's heading towards our betterment? Or are we being guided underneath all of this to something a little bit sinister, towards something that will actually sabotage the very nature of our identity and our value as human beings?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's evidence all around us now, and see it in statistics. And I'm not talking about anything to do with the pandemic era, but we can see evidence for decreasing lifespans, for the first time in a couple of hundred years in developed Western nations. Recently been reading Ian McGilchrist's masterpiece, recently published 2-volume The Matter with Things, and one of the things he documents is declining mental capacity in humans. You take even those two things together, physical and mental decline. Well, what does that sound like? It's like that's the classic signs of, to a greater or lesser extent, affects us all. As our bodies weaken and move towards, ultimate bodily death.
Yeah,
exactly. And it seems, and the terrible thing is, there's just so much of what we call science fiction over the years that has seemed to show this dystopic future and ahead of us. And unfortunately, the whole concept in people's minds is, no, that's science fiction, and it's unreal.
Yeah.
But really, science fiction does seem to have somehow predicted an absolute reality, which is taking place and unfolding right in front of us. And really, it seems to me that the only sectors of society that have an interest in this, that are getting something out of it, are those who have a financial interest in its development. So, and they are pushing forward this idea that it's great for us too, because they are obviously benefiting from it. But it just, if you look at it in the cold light of day, it is most definitely a devolution. It's not an evolution.
Because don't forget, it's not just science that's causing the systems to cash in on all of this. You've got the other side. You've got the guys who are supposed to be responsible for understanding the observer, what consciousness is, where, how it continues. Because one of the biggest things here that Nigel picks upon is really, they're trying to sell us immortality in a physical system. in the presence of entropy, that really is impossible in the long term. Whereas in fact, the soul being a connection right back to the beginning, a whole set of memories, all the way back to the origin of the universe, means that the soul, the consciousness, is already immortal. And therefore, what we really need to do, and Nigel's tried to address this, is to concentrate on what are the properties of this observer? What happens to you when you die? Do you come back again? And if you do, why is that happening? And if you're able to leave the entire system, why does that happen? And what do you have to do to achieve it? I think, that religions are not serving us either. I think that their job as an interface between consciousness or rather understanding of consciousness and feeding information into mankind is not there either. So I think people are just wallowing in a sea of increasing linear information, and they're unable to gain a moral compass to tell them which way to go to either increase or decrease the entropy.
Yeah, and I think I just like to come in here. I think where Nigel's work is quite unique and why it impresses me so much is you do get lots of people who do question this. And you get religious people who say, okay, so it doesn't seem to be evolution. But then they talk about that you get the creationists who talk about what seems to me to be a totally nonsensical, unrealistic picture that God created the world, which would make no sense because of human suffering, how something perfect would create suffering. That's to me, that's just a complete paradox. And then you've got other people who, well, they accept that creationism isn't true, but they somehow try to configure evolution into a religious idea as well and put those two things together. And I remember reading Russell Stannard's books about that, and he has great arguments which show that various assumptions made by science don't seem to hold water. But his alternative it's just not logical. It just doesn't hang together. And the really impressive thing about Nigel's work is that he actually gives a whole paradigm to explain how not only is the scientific explanation of the Big Bang and evolution and everything originating from a material source, not only does that not seem to hang together, but he puts forward a very, very credible other explanation for it. And that's unique. I haven't actually seen that anywhere else. And that's one of the reasons why I felt compelled to work with Nigel for so many years, because he just seemed to put the whole thing together and answered a lot of questions that I couldn't find answered anywhere else.
Yes, his work is incredibly wide-ranging in that respect. The third book in his trilogy, if I can call it that, is the only one I've currently read, as I mentioned last time. But each one of the chapters, fairly short chapters, often as not, could have been expanded into a book, in my opinion.
Yes. I think so too.
There's so many ideas there. Brief aside, as for science fiction, those genres in the 20th century and beyond have been obsessed with two particular tropes. One is our future in the stars, the Star Trek. That's as we spread ourselves out across the galaxy and just fantastic technological utopia. The other is the dystopian one. It's whether it's Blade Runner or whether it's Mad Max, it's the collapse and descent into barbarism, and anything in between, which is much more likely, really, seems to be precluded. So, and just for a plug for my own content, if listeners interested in that particular area, if they check out my video series, Hauntology and Dystopia, which is ongoing, I look at a lot of late 20th century science fiction in that context, TV and movies. And there's so much predictive programming, you might want to call it, so many things in there that we're like, oh, hang on. Especially when you look back, these are cultural artifacts that you guys will be familiar with, being of the generation that you are, or at least you'll have heard of. And my God, we're being set up for so many things. That's what it looks like. And even quite sober commentators who don't get into metaphysical realms have said, were we doing this to ourselves? Did we somehow know the direction we were going in, or were we being steered in a particular direction? And influencers behind the scenes were trying to soften us up for it. But either way, it's quite uncanny.
Yes. In fact, if the X-Files series was kind of like that, and it may well be an illustration of what you're saying, because there were so many programs which seemed to be exploring the possibility that the whole UFO phenomenon was something that was being held down and it was real, and many other paranormal phenomenon like it were disregarded by society. And then in the last episode, they say, actually, it's all created by the government and it's not real anyway. And I remember seeing that, and it just made me think, are they just doing this, as you say, to just soften people up, to draw you in, and then say, actually, it's all nonsense. So yeah, that definitely reminded me of that when you said that. And also, very interestingly, I don't know if you know this or listeners know this, but the creator of Black Mirror, which is just the most chilling series, but the most seemingly realistic series in terms of modern times, actually stopped writing the series, as far as I know, because it just all kept coming true, and he couldn't bear it any longer.
Oh yeah, there's a number of novels, like fictional stories, and TV and movies and stuff orientated around this. And the connection there is, of course, with the idea of magic, and literally, you writing something, speaking about something, and it coming true. But everything that's real begins with a thought. Even scientists would have to concede that. I mean, how many scientists who've had radical, world-changing breakthroughs had them like in the bath or sat in a darkened room, and eureka moments and just things seem to come to them from somewhere else or something else. And,
absolutely.
And then I agree.
So we've been using the word devolution, the idea there being evolution we talked about earlier, coming up from the primordial soup, up from the mud, which again, to me, I accepted it as a premise.
I did for many years.
Yeah,
until Nigel said to me, "I don't think it's like that, and this is why." And I just said rubbish and went away. But later on, I thought about it, and I came back to him, and I said, "I think you're right."
Yeah, I can vouch for that. I was there when they had an argument about this, so I know all about this.
I struggled with it in terms that you've mentioned. Like, okay, right, this is what I'm being told by my teachers, for example. This is what I'm reading in the natural history books. But a lot of it didn't make sense. I thought, just to my mind, I wasn't setting myself up as some kind of budding expert, but I thought, from what I sense, and again, this is something that we're encouraged to deny, our sense about something, or the sixth sense, our hunches about things, our gut feeling about things. Every way that we gain information that is not from our five senses or logic, we're told to disregard. But that logic is not to be disregarded. Our five senses are not to be disregarded, but they're not every way that we source information about reality. So, and then when I read the term devolution, so this is coming down from, and I mentioned Michael Cremo's book, and the coming down from it is obviously what Nigel talks about, and you see that obviously in spiritual traditions, don't you? And great myths and origin legends, about where we all came from. And it involves a coming down, a descending into crude matter. And we had a brief off-air discussion about ancient civilizations, the antediluvian so-called lost civilizations, such as Atlantis and Lemuria. And many writers are trying to piece together if there was anything to these myths, speak about lighter beings, if not beings of light. We're less, our material reality in the past was less heavy and dense than it is now. And all of that actually is a really interesting wrinkle in this for me, because it feeds into what Nigel was writing about and what you guys were saying.
Absolutely, it does. Oh, I mean, I agree with it entirely. The concept of devolution, just to carry it on slightly further, means that, people are arguing with, or rather, people, neo-Darwinists. They once Mendel came along and discovered the concept of genetics. they sort of lumped all of this together in terms of this concept of evolution as a explanation for what Darwin was saying. But Darwin was talking, for example, with the finches, and Nigel actually mentions this, that they were, randomly adapting, and only those that survived would be able to eat the nuts or the berries or whatever. But Nigel was putting it in terms of, well, there was intent behind this, and really that the birds wanted to achieve this end, and therefore the adaptation came from the intent to do it, rather than the randomness to be able to do it, which is far more consistent with thermodynamics and the adaptation to environment that Darwin was actually talking about it, to put the consciousness in there. In fact, Darwin talked about God quite a few times. So the concept here, and Nigel has often said this, is that, human beings, that this concept of being a very light being at the beginning, to a hydrogen man, to a slightly more physically orientated light being that started to interact with matter, right down, and these lines all devolved, and therefore they formed the openings for consciousness to come into different species at different times. And that happens on every viable planet. So where there is an opportunity, life will occupy it. And so, this sort of dispels in some ways the concept of the panspermia, for instance, because the panspermia is a more materialistic approach to such a concept, whereas this is that consciousness is actually a function of all space and time anyway. And therefore, as a species then devolves, it becomes more and more restricted in what it can do. And if we take the examples of, our own civilization at an early time, we think that the advancement of civilization is in fact the development of technology. Whereas in fact, if you look at it from the other perspective, the development of technology is there as prostheses to replace lost conscious functions, such as, the ability to communicate with each other over long distances, etc. And each of these functions that becomes lost starts to become replaced with an increasing technology. And, we're at a stage now where we're into the technology so much that, as you quite rightly said, we're beginning to lose our educational capacity, our mental capacity, and we're beginning to start to merge into an AI hive, which is really the end point of the whole process.
That concludes part 1 of our interview. Part 2 will be available soon in the subscribers area at legalizefreedom.com.
legalizefreedom.com